Okay, so today we are going to begin the ending of the Old Testament history section. I have 18 more chapters, at least chapters as we've divided them up, left to do. I have Ezra chapter 7 through 10, and then the entire book of Nehemiah. Ezra, okay, so we finished Malachi, okay. It's hard to say exactly when Malachi came along in relation to Ezra and Nehemiah. They were all around the same time, in the 400s BC. The first, Ezra and Nehemiah is a kind of a messy book chronologically, because it covers about 100 years of history, and it does so in patchwork fashion. It's a couple. First of all, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we have them so split into two separate books, and they may have been two separate books at the beginning. It's like they were combined into one very early. So you go most of the ancient history. These books were combined into one. They were eventually split into two. They may have started off as two books way back, if you go far enough back in time, because you have some sections that are clearly written by Ezra in the first person, I, Ezra, and then some sections that are written by Nehemiah. A lot of the book of Nehemiah is written by Nehemiah in the first person, I, Nehemiah. But not all of it, okay? There are these third-person accounts that are in between there, and of course then you have the first 6 chapters of Ezra, which take place years before Ezra. Ezra himself doesn't actually show up in the book of Ezra until Ezra 7. There's only 10 chapters of Ezra. So most of the book of Ezra doesn't even have Ezra in it. And that stuff, which you've already read, Ezra 1 through 6, occurs when they first come back to the land in the 530s and 520s BC. Ezra doesn't get there until 458 BC, like 50, 60 years later. And then Nehemiah comes along a dozen years after that or so. So there is and then Nehemiah goes down into the 420s BC maybe. So there is like 100 years, from the beginning of Ezra to the end of Nehemiah, there's like 100 years of history. From about 520 to 420 BC they get covered. And it's very patchy. It's mostly chronological, but not necessarily all of it. And so it is kind of like a patchwork quilt sort of narrative. So we've already read the first 6 chapters of Ezra, which concern their return to the land and the rebuilding of the temple, which we read about that in connection to their actual return to the land and at the end of their Babylonian captivity when the Persians took over Babylon. And that was in the 530s BC, and they came back to the land. They finally rebuilt the temple and got that done in 515 or so BC. We read about that in Haggai and Zechariah. Okay, and that was the first 6 chapters of Ezra. Now we're going to get to Ezra 7, and we're going to skip. And then we read the book of Esther, which took place in the meantime. Esther takes place in Persia, and it takes place in the 470s BC. And then somewhere along this time frame, the prophet Malachi comes along, and we read that book about Malachi's prophecies. And I don't know, I think it's basically impossible to determine exactly where Malachi fits into the time frame here. But he's clearly a contemporary of Ezra or Nehemiah, because he talks about the same things they do. He's talking about the governor. He's talking about the concerns that Ezra and Nehemiah. He may have been Ezra or Nehemiah. There is a chance that as I said when I read the book of Malachi, there's a chance that Malachi isn't even a name, but a title meaning messenger. So he may not even have been known as Malachi. So it's possible that we read about the guy who is Malachi in this account of Ezra and Nehemiah just by another name. It's possible. We won't know until we get there and we can ask him. I really don't know. So anyway, I read him first because that helps set some of the context for what's going on in this period of time. Ezra is now coming back to the land. Ezra has been in Babylon. As far as I can tell, he had never been to Jerusalem before. He's going to be coming to Jerusalem in the year 458 BC, according to our calendars. As far as I can tell, Ezra had never been to Jerusalem before. There's no reason, at least, to think or assume that he had been. It's possible that maybe earlier in his life he'd been there, and then he went to Babylon. Maybe he was there in Jerusalem on a visit, and then I don't know. He's in Babylon. He goes to Jerusalem, presumably to stay there. He goes to Jerusalem presumably to stay. He is there to initiate religious reform. Now Nehemiah will come along later, and he will be there with the authority of Artaxerxes, the king at the time, as to be appointed as governor to carry out political reform and economic reform. Ezra is here to initiate spiritual reform. Somehow or another, and I do not know how, the Spirit of God was on him somehow. But somehow or another, Ezra became aware. Ezra, living in Babylon, presumably having lived his life in Babylon, presumably, somehow or another, Ezra became aware of bad spiritual conditions in the land of Judah. So they came back from captivity. It's been a couple generations by now. Okay, they came back. They started coming back. They started making the journey back in 538 BC. This is now 458 BC. This is like 80 years later. Okay, they built the temple and they commissioned it and dedicated it. And that was in 515, I think, BC when they finished that. Okay, so this is now 55 plus years after the temple has been finished. And the temple itself didn't get finished for 20 years after they got back. Okay, so they've had now 70, 80 years to be back in the land. They've been in the land now longer than they were gone from it. You know, their actual length of captivity, exile, was from 586 to 536 BC, so about 50 years. Okay, so this has been longer than that. Now they've been back in the land for longer than they were gone from it. And I guess things are going okay, so to speak. I mean, you read about Malachi. The people are not idolaters, really, not like they had been, but they're not in good shape. Okay, it's like their overall living conditions are not great. Their attitudes are not great. And even though they're not bowing down to idols, there's definitely a love lost for God going on here. I read that when I read the book of Malachi. Essentially what's happening, and that's kind of the background context for all that we're going to read from now until the end of Nehemiah, is you have a bunch of people who are just getting tired. They have heard, the law itself was given to Moses 1,000 years ago at this point in time. They left Egypt in 1446 BC. This is now 458 BC, so almost 1,000 years later. So, and they've been hearing these, and David was king in around 1000 BC, so he's been king 500+ years ago. Like that was a while ago, okay? That's getting to be quite some time now, and they've been hearing about this king that's going to come and be like David or better than David, and he still hasn't gotten here. They're back in the land. They were gone from the land, now they're back in the land, but the kingdom hasn't come. They're still subservient to the Persians, and they're just getting tired. I think is ultimately what's going on here. Like they're just getting tired of it. So Ezra is coming to Babylon, coming from Babylon to Jerusalem to revive them spiritually, to get them back into the proper mindset and proper attitudes, and teach them the law. This is going to be the beginning of what we will call the profession of the scribes. In the New Testament, we're going to be reading about these scribes a lot. Ezra is a priest. He has a very long and distinguished genealogy, as we're going to read here at the beginning of Ezra 7. And he is establishing his credentials by giving his lengthy genealogy back to Aaron, the first high priest. And he is here so he is a priest, he's fully qualified, he's here to reform the temple rituals and get the people back to the proper worship systems. While he's here, he's going to encounter a crisis that he was not anticipating, and that's going to form the content of the second part of this material, and that will lead into Nehemiah when Nehemiah gets there a few years later. Ezra is a priest, a scribe. He is thoroughly learned and studied in the law, and now you have to remember, during the years they were in Babylon, they could not completely fulfill the requirements of their law, the Torah. Because it required the temple, it required the sacrificial system, it required the purification rituals. So while they were in captivity and they were not in the land, they were in an unclean land, and the temple was no longer functioning. So they could not fulfill their Torah the way that they were supposed to. So in the meantime, and God didn't necessarily tell them what to do about that. We've read through this material now, going back to the end of Kings and Chronicles, in the book into Jeremiah and Daniel, Ezekiel. So we've read a lot of material now that came about during this time. And as it stands, as we've as we've seen, as we're going to continue to see here, God didn't tell them what to do about this. He didn't give them a solution to this problem. They were in an unclean land. They did not have a functioning temple or priesthood, so they could not become clean. They were ritually impure, and they could do nothing about that. Even the righteous ones, like Daniel, and Daniel wasn't a priest to begin with, but it's like he couldn't do anything to cleanse himself of his impurities, or be cleansed of his impurities. And God didn't tell them, God didn't give them an answer for that. He didn't give them a solution for how they should go about this. How to deal with this problem. Now, when they got back to the land, he wanted to build the temple. Okay, but during their captivity, he was talking to them through the prophets. He had Ezekiel in the city there in Babylon with them, but he didn't give them a solution as to how to make themselves, how to fulfill the Torah requirements when they couldn't. He didn't tell them that. So they kind of took it upon themselves to devise their own solutions. And that's where we get a lot of the New Testament stuff, like the synagogues and things like that. Because there is no requirement anywhere in the Old Testament of them meeting in the synagogues. Okay? That was something that they made up. That was something that they started doing during and just after the exile to make up for the loss of the temple, which was their gathering place before that. Instead of burning incense, they started praying and fasting. We read about that already in Haggai and Zechariah, how often they fasted. Okay, so that was kind of their replacement for burning incense, which they couldn't do without the incense altar. They didn't have an incense altar because it had been destroyed. So Ezra is getting to the land at a time when the people have they've been living for 80 plus years now in the land. For 100 plus years since the first temple, the first temple fell in 586 BC. That was 130 or so years ago. And since then, they've kind of made up their own system of rules to augment or supplement and eventually going to kind of replace the system of rules that God gave them in his actual law of Moses. And we're going to read all about that in the New Testament times. Because what's going to happen in between the Testaments is they're going to develop this even broader set of rules as a hedge around the Torah. And that'll set the context of the New Testament. So we're seeing the beginnings of that even now here in this period of time. So Ezra is coming to Jerusalem to initiate religious reform and get the people back to the actual written requirements of God as given in the law of Moses that they had. So that's what's happening in the beginning of Ezra. And so that was the intro to that. And so we'll read that next. We're going to be starting in Ezra 7. Remember, Ezra doesn't even appear in Ezra 1 through 6. That happened 60 years before he got there.